The walls had stood for generations. Massive stones rose high above the plain, forming a fortress that seemed impossible to breach. Soldiers watched from towers. Gates were sealed. Families hid behind thick walls, believing that no army could break through. And yet, outside the city, something strange was happening. Thousands of Israelites were marching around Jericho. They carried no ladders, no siege towers, no battering rams. No weapons were raised against the walls. At the center of the procession, priests carried the Ark of the Covenant. 7 other priests walked before it, blowing 7 ram's horn trumpets. And the people remained silent. For 6 days, they had done the same thing. Walk, listen, obey. Then came the 7th day. This time, they would march around the city 7 times. And when the final trumpet sounded, Joshua would give one command: shout. What happened next would become one of the most unforgettable moments in the history of Israel. Because on that day, the strongest walls did not fall to an army. They fell before the power of God. For 40 long years, the children of Israel had wandered through the wilderness. An entire generation had lived between the memory of Egypt and the promise of a land they had not yet possessed. Moses had led them out of slavery. They had crossed the Red Sea. They had seen bread fall from heaven and water flow from rock. But Moses was now gone. A new leader stood before Israel. His name was Joshua. Joshua had once been a servant of Moses. He had watched his leader face Pharaoh, climb Mount Sinai, and guide a stubborn nation through years of hardship. Now the responsibility rested on him. God had commanded Joshua to be strong and courageous. The time of wandering was over. Israel was going into the land that God had promised to Abraham generations earlier. But possession of the land would not come without opposition, and the first great obstacle stood directly before them: Jericho. Jericho was more than just another town. It guarded an important entrance into the land of Canaan. Its walls gave its people security. From a distance, the city looked untouchable. To any ordinary military commander, the problem would have been obvious. How could a wandering people with no great siege machines defeat a fortified city? How long would it take to break through walls like these? How many soldiers would die trying? But something had already begun to change inside Jericho. The people were afraid. Stories had reached them. They had heard about the God of Israel. They had heard how the waters of the Red Sea had opened. They had heard how kings east of the Jordan had been defeated, and now Israel was approaching. The fear was not because Israel had the greatest army. It was because people believed that Israel's God was fighting for them. Before Israel crossed fully into the land, Joshua secretly sent 2 men to spy out Jericho. They entered the city and came to the house of a woman named Rahab. But their presence did not remain secret for long. Word reached the king of Jericho that Israelite spies had entered the city. Soldiers were sent to Rahab's house. The danger was immediate. If the spies were discovered, they would almost certainly be killed. But Rahab made a decision that would change the future of her entire family. She hid the 2 men among stalks of flax laid out on her roof. When the king's men arrived, she sent them away in another direction. After the soldiers left, Rahab went up to the roof. There, she told the spies something remarkable. The people of Jericho already knew what God had done for Israel. They were terrified. Their courage had melted away. Rahab believed that the God of Israel was the true God of heaven and earth. Then she asked for mercy. She had protected the spies. Now she begged them to protect her family when Israel came against Jericho. The spies agreed. They gave her a sign: a scarlet cord. Rahab was to tie it in the window through which she would help them escape. When Israel entered the city, everyone gathered inside that house would be spared. Rahab lowered the men through the window by a rope. The spies escaped, and a scarlet cord remained hanging from the wall of Jericho, a quiet sign of hope in a city destined to fall. The spies returned to Joshua with confidence. The land was ready. Even the people of Jericho were afraid. Soon, Israel came to the Jordan River. The river stood between them and the land they had waited generations to enter. But as the priests carrying the ark stepped into the water, the river stopped flowing before them. The people crossed on dry ground. Once again, God had made a way where there had been no way. 12 stones were taken from the riverbed and set up as a memorial. Future generations would ask what those stones meant, and Israel would remember. God had brought them across. Now Jericho stood ahead. One day, Joshua stood near the city. Perhaps he was studying the walls. Perhaps he was thinking like a commander. Where should the attack begin? Where was the weakest point? How could Israel overcome such defenses? Then Joshua looked up. A man stood before him with a drawn sword in his hand. Joshua approached and asked whether he was for Israel or for their enemies. The answer was unexpected: neither. The figure identified himself as the commander of the army of the Lord. Joshua fell face down. This was not ultimately Joshua's battle. It was God's. Joshua was told to remove his sandals because the ground on which he stood was holy. Before Israel ever attacked Jericho, Joshua had to understand something. Victory would not come because he had developed the best strategy. He was standing under the command of God, and the strategy God would give him made little sense by ordinary standards. Jericho was completely shut. No one went out. No one came in. Its people were preparing for an attack. But God told Joshua that the city had already been given into his hands. Then came the instructions. Israel's armed men were to march around the city once. 7 priests carrying 7 ram's horn trumpets would walk before the ark. The Ark of the Covenant would move with them. They would do this once each day, for 6 days. Then, on the 7th day, they were to march around Jericho 7 times. At the end of the 7th circuit, the priests would blow a long blast on their trumpets. Then all the people would shout, and the walls would fall. Imagine Joshua hearing those instructions. No siege, no attempt to burn the gates, no scaling of the walls, no visible military advantage, just marching, trumpets, silence, and obedience. Joshua did not argue. He prepared the people. The gates of Jericho remained tightly closed. Soldiers stood along the walls as the Israelites approached. But instead of attacking, the army formed a procession. Armed men went first. Behind them came 7 priests with trumpets. Then came the Ark of the Covenant, and more men followed behind. Joshua gave the people a strict command: do not shout. Do not let your voices be heard. Do not speak until the day he told them to shout. The procession began to move around Jericho. The priests blew their trumpets. The sound echoed against the stone walls. But from the people came no battle cry, no threats, no insults, only footsteps, thousands of footsteps. The people of Jericho watched from above. Perhaps some laughed. Perhaps soldiers shouted mockery down at them. Perhaps others simply stared, confused. Israel completed 1 circuit around the city. Then they returned to their camp. That was all. No attack came. The walls still stood. The next morning, Israel returned. Again, the procession formed. Again, the priests blew their trumpets. Again, the people walked silently around Jericho. And again, after 1 complete circuit, they returned to camp. Then came the 3rd day, the 4th, the 5th, the 6th. The same command, the same walls, the same march, the same sound of trumpets. Nothing appeared to change. That may have been the greatest test. It is one thing to obey when results come immediately. It is another to keep obeying when the walls still stand in front of you. Every evening, Israel returned to the camp with Jericho looking exactly as strong as it had that morning. But obedience was not useless. Something was happening. The people were learning not to trust their own strength. And inside the city, the strange silence outside the walls may have become more terrifying than any attack. Day after day, Israel returned. They were not leaving. They were waiting. Before dawn on the 7th day, Israel rose early. This day would not be like the others. The people took their places. The armed men, the priests, the trumpets, the ark. Thousands of men and women waited for the command. Then they began to move. 1 circuit. The walls stood. A 2nd circuit. Still nothing. A 3rd. The priests continued blowing their trumpets. A 4th. Dust rose beneath the feet of the marching people. A 5th. The citizens of Jericho watched from above. By now they could see that Israel was not turning back toward camp. A 6th circuit. The tension grew. 6 days before, the people of Jericho may have laughed at this strange army. But now the Israelites continued marching, again and again. Then came the 7th and final circuit. The people walked around the city one last time. The walls still towered above them. The gates were still closed. The soldiers were still watching. Everything looked exactly as it had before. Then the procession stopped. The priests raised their trumpets. A long blast sounded. The note rolled across the plain and struck the walls of Jericho. Joshua turned to the people. The moment had come. For 7 days they had held their voices. Now Joshua gave the command, "Shout, for the Lord has given you the city." And Israel shouted. Thousands of voices erupted at once. The sound rose like thunder. Then the ground began to shake. Dust slipped from the stones. Cracks appeared across the walls. The people of Jericho looked down in terror. The great stones began to move. Sections of the wall split apart. Towers shook. Then, with a roar greater than the voices of the army, the defenses of Jericho began to collapse. Stone crashed upon stone. Walls that had stood against enemies for generations gave way. Clouds of dust exploded upward. The city's greatest source of confidence disappeared in moments. Jericho had trusted in its walls, but its walls could not stand before the God of Israel. With the defenses broken, the Israelites moved forward. Each man advanced straight into the city, through the places where the walls had fallen. The city that had seemed impossible to enter was now open before them. Jericho fell. But in the middle of judgment, one promise was remembered: Rahab. Joshua ordered the 2 spies to go to the house of the woman who had protected them. Rahab was brought out. Her father, her mother, her brothers, her relatives. Everyone who had gathered with her was rescued. The scarlet cord had marked a place of mercy. While a city fell around her, Rahab's faith had saved her household. She would not simply survive Jericho. She would eventually become part of the people of Israel. Her story would continue far beyond those broken walls. The fall of Jericho was never simply a story about military victory. Israel did not break the walls with superior weapons. Joshua did not win because he was a brilliant siege commander. For 6 days, nothing seemed to happen. Then, on the 7th day, the people obeyed the final command. And God did what Israel could never have done alone. The lesson was clear from the beginning of Israel's life in the Promised Land. They would not possess the future through strength alone. They would have to trust God. Sometimes obedience would make sense. Sometimes it would not. Sometimes God's command would seem completely different from the solution people expected. But Jericho became proof that the strongest obstacle is not always as strong as it appears. There are moments when a wall can seem permanent. A problem can look too large. A path can appear completely closed. Jericho looked that way. Its walls were real. Its soldiers were real. Its gates were real. Israel could see them all. But there was something greater that they could not see. The God who had brought them out of Egypt had not abandoned them at the border of the Promised Land. The same God who opened the sea could bring down a wall. And when Israel obeyed, the impossible barrier fell. Not after the first march, not after the second, not even after the 6th day. They continued until the moment God had appointed. Then came the trumpet, then came the shout, and then came the fall of Jericho. The lesson has echoed for generations. Faith does not always mean understanding the plan. Sometimes faith means taking another step around the wall when nothing appears to be changing. Because when God says the way will open, even the strongest walls cannot stand forever.